And again, these captions are quite specific in terms of the scenes and the campaigns that they portray. Some scenes actually illustrate the process in which these victory stelae were erected on the farthest borders of the empire. We know that Shalmaneser actually reached the source of the Tigris way up in Turkey, near Lake Urmia, and so we see a depiction on the Balawat gates of Shalmaneser reaching the source of the Tigris, and as you can see here, actually carving a victory stele to commemorate the discovery. So that process of making the unknown known is right here, on the Balawat gates. And we do actually have inscriptions at the area itself in a system of caves, and you can see these are actually sort of stylized caves. If you remember, these are our stylized mountains, and you can see these Assyrian explorers making their way into the caves and finding the source of the Tigris River, and then inscribing this stele commemorating Shalmaneser. And you can compare that to the actual victory steles themselves, right? This is a stele of Ashurnasirpal II, and if you look at the two, right, it's very clear what's going on here. And again, we do have Assyrian inscriptions at the actual site, so this isn't just propaganda. This actually did happen. Another object in which we see the continuation of Assyrian art and propaganda from the time of Shalmaneser III is the Black Obelisk. The Black Obelisk is also in the British Museum, and it was actually set up in the central square of the Nimrud Citadel. So it's a very public monument. It's been seen by people entering and exiting Nimrud. And it's a combination, again, of text and image that records the first 31 years of Shalmaneser's rule. As you can see, it's four-sided with a stepped top, very similar to a ziggurat, in each case inscribed, right, with the deeds of the king. And it shows representations of rulers, several panels, in fact 20 total panels, 5 panels on each side, so 5 times 4, 20 panels, and really shows tribute being brought to the king in terms of goods and also in terms of dignitaries making their way before him. You kind of think too, Shalmaneser, who instead of founding his own capital, right, stayed at Nimrud. Well, right, Ashurnasirpal had already filled the walls with his own, standard inscriptions, his own records of his deeds. Draw up here. So, I mean, with the walls taken up, it makes a lot of sense that what you're going to do in an area that's completely surrounded by reliefs, well, what are you going to do? How are you going to display these reliefs? Well, you create a square object which on all sides, right, has the same shapes of things that you want to portray. So it makes a lot of sense, that Shalmaneser decided to move to this new form of depiction at Nimrud, particularly using this black obelisk to talk about his deeds. I want to point out a few of the particulars here, because we actually have some connections in this obelisk between the Assyrian accounts and the actual accounts that are in the Old Testament. We know, for example, here we see a depiction of an Israelite ruler coming and laying down before the king, right, submitting before Shalmaneser III, and this image, this individual, is identified as Yahuwah son of Hunri, which is actually Jehu son of Omri. And we know that Jehu was the son of Omri, and that this is a character that we do know from the Old Testament as well. In this case, we see Jehu depicted as an Assyrian vassal submitting before the king. And just in terms of composition, right, you can see this use of negative space, right, this glaring empty space in the obelisk, right, which your eye is drawn to immediately. So very conspicuous use of negative space to emphasize the point that Jehu is not standing before the Assyrian king. He is kneeling, and he's on all fours, crawling like a dog. And being on all fours is actually, in the Assyrian text, a way of describing people who come before you and submit. What's more, also, we see Shalmaneser in the same pose as Ashurnasirpal, right, with the wine cup. He doesn't have his bow, but in the same sense, right, he is holding up this vessel, and in a lot of ways, sort of ritually conquering in this case the Israelites. Some of this tribute that's being brought too. Again, we see precious vessels that are clearly from different parts, right, from the Levant, from Babylon, and actually camels for the first time, right? These double-humped camels. These are Bactrian camels with two humps, and they're said to come from a place called Musri. It's kind of unclear where Musri is. It might be Egypt, but Bactrian camels are more common to Iran. And right, we are now in 858 thereabouts, and the camels domesticated around 1000 BCE. So it's no mistake that we're actually seeing camels being used for caravan trade during this time. But again, these are specific camels, the two-hump variety, which would have been a bit of an oddity in the Assyrian heartland. We saw this before, right? In Ashurnasirpal, right? All of these strange animals being brought to him, monkeys and whatnot. Same thing's taking place with Shalmaneser. Shalmaneser, while he doesn't leave Nimrud, is still a builder. In fact, he actually constructs a large palace at Nimrud, but not in the main citadel. So here's the citadel of Nimrud, right? The city of Nimrud, or Kalhu, and then the citadel area and the northwest palace of Ashurnasirpal II. We actually see Shalmaneser move to the far end of the city, where he constructs another palace that is known as the Ikal Masharti, and that's actually down here. Ikal Masharti roughly translates to a show palace, and by show palace, Shalmaneser tells us that this palace was dedicated for the ordnance of the camp, for the maintenance of weapons, for the storage of horses, and war equipment of all kinds. Also, the display of booty, the display of all the objects that are being brought in terms of tribute, and also those that are caught on the annual campaign. So all the stuff that they're accruing year by year by year is actually going into this palace and being held there. We see three main courtyards in the north, and then again a small series of a throne room. So this is actually echoing, right, what's taking place in the Northwest Palace. Entrance, again, into these courtyards, 1, 2, the inner and outer courtyards, the Babanu and Bitanu courtyards, and then, right, a bent axis approach into a long throne room, again, with a throne base. And we'll look at that throne base in a moment. But again, Fort Shalmaneser, this Ikal Marashti, this show palace, is built in the same style of the Northwest Palace. It's actually surrounded by a series of workshops too, and these workshops would have maintained the chariotry. They would have essentially kept the Assyrian war machine running. And you can see in the construction here all of these long, thin rooms. The majority of this palace is actually dedicated to storage. These are storage rooms that would have held, again, all of the spoils of war from the Assyrian campaigns to the west and also to the south. We see there aren't any reliefs, any orthostats at Fort Shalmaneser, but we do have some glazed brick panels that survive. And on them, again, the same sorts of, I'm sorry, this slide is not very good, but you can see these Apkallu figures, again, well actually no, I'm sorry, this is the Assyrian king. In the same set of symmetrical depiction that we saw at the throne room at Ashurnasirpal, right? Flanking this sacred tree motif. So even though this medium is new, it's these glazed bricks that were constructed one by one. In fact, again, right, those are mentioned in the banquet stele of Ashurnasirpal. He says he decorates the temples with glazed bricks. We have examples of that later during the time of Shalmaneser. The same sorts of iconography are crossing mediums, not just sculpture, but glazed brick as well. And at this, in the lower sections of this palace, again, that main courtyard leading into a throne room, we actually have the dais, the throne base, which is made out of two slabs of limestone, two massive slabs of limestone. That was actually preserved at Fort Shalmaneser, and as you can see, would have been right here. This throne room is almost identical to the one in the Northwest Palace, so it's clear what Shalmaneser is doing. The throne base is decorated and also inscribed. It summarizes the first 13 years of Shalmaneser's rule, and it's surrounded, as you can see, by a series of reliefs. But at the center of these reliefs, right at the center, is a very, very unique depiction. And in it, we actually see Shalmaneser, again, our Assyrian king, depicted with his clear Assyrian crown, shaking hands with Marduk-Zakir-Shumi, also up on the board. Marduk-Zakir-Shumi is the king of Babylon. And in this depiction, right, the two are clearly equals. And this is very unique, again, considering what we know about Assyrian ideology and Assyria's attitude towards others. What we know is that actually Assyria and Babylon had a very tight relationship during this time. They actually formalized their treaties and connections through intermarriage. Around 900 BC, Shalmaneser's great-grandfather has ties with them. But particularly Marduk-Zakir-Shumi and Shalmaneser go way back together. Marduk-Zakir-Shumi is deposed briefly by his brother and writes to Shalmaneser for help. And Shalmaneser actually comes to the aid of Marduk-Zakir-Shumi and is able to overthrow this usurper, right, the brother. And in return, Shalmaneser is actually invited to Babylon. He goes to Babylon and visits the religious centers there. He makes sacrifices at the temples. He brings gifts. He attends banquets. So this is actually a depiction of two leaders who fought in battle together, who go way, way back. Really a depiction of old friends, New Assyrian bromance, if you will. Which, right, when we compare that to the depiction of these vassals, when we compare that to Jehu, son of Omri, again, strikingly clear the difference. And it just goes, again, to show that this Assyrian ideology, while in some ways is depicted as being very black and white, the reality, of course, is much more complex. Assyria and Babylon, even though they do have their problems, and later on they continue to sort of fight and skirmish and attack one another, really Shalmaneser's interest is a little more complicated.